Welcome back. Last time we looked at the question, can we trust that the New Testament we've got today is the same as the New Testament as it was originally written down? And we concluded that pretty much, yeah, we can. Today we're going to look at another big question, and today's big question is connected. It's, can we trust that the New Testament as it was originally written is accurate and reliable? Can we trust that the New Testament as it was originally written is accurate and reliable? And I think it's clearest if we take this question apart a bit more. If we ask first, were the authors planning to write history? Then did they know what happened? And then can we trust them? Helpful way of breaking the question down. So first then, were the authors planning to write history? And I think the answer's pretty clear. Here is Luke chapter 1, verses 1 to 4. Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who were from the first, were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. With this in mind, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things you've been taught. Here's Acts chapter 1, verses 1 and 2. In my former book, Theophilus, I wrote about all that Jesus began to do and to teach, until the day he was taken up to heaven, after giving instructions through the Holy Spirit to the apostles he had chosen. Or here's John 21, verse 24. This is the disciple who testifies to these things and who wrote them down. We know that his testimony is true. Or 1 John 1, verse 1. That which was from the beginning, which we've heard, which we've seen with our eyes, which we've looked at and our hands have touched. This we proclaim concerning the word of life. And there's others as well, but they're all clearly claiming to be describing events that happened. In many cases that happened to them, in some cases that happened to other people who they've met, and wanting to do so as accurately as possible, especially Luke. And ancient fiction and myths look very different from ancient history. Here's a quote from C.S. Lewis, who was Professor of Medieval and Renaissance Literature at Cambridge. I've been reading poems, romances, vision literature, legends and myths all my life. I know what they're like. I know none of them are like this. Of this gospel text there are only two possible views. Either this is reportage, or else some unknown ancient author without known precedents or successors suddenly anticipated the whole technique of modern novelistic realistic narrative. So yes, the authors were planning to write history. But did they know what actually happened? Now, as we've seen, the Gospels claim to be based on eyewitness accounts, but since the 1800s there's been an attempt by scholars to get behind the text to look at the sources and the belief that the Gospels we have now are actually based on earlier documents which are now lost. And what they usually come down to is something like this. Mark was written as a single unit. The Greek reads like it was written by a Jew who didn't speak Greek very well. Matthew and Luke both seem to have had access to a copy of Mark. There are places where they both essentially quote from Mark, but tidy up the Greek in slightly different styles. Matthew reads like it was written by a Jew who spoke Greek much better than Mark did. Luke reads like it was written by a native Greek speaker. But Matthew and Luke both seem to have other sources. Some of those are things they have in common, which is traditionally called Q. Some bits are also unique to Matthew, and some bits are unique to Luke. And then there's John, who uses some bits of the same material as the others, but a huge amount of his own stuff. The reason I mention this is that Christians sometimes find it scary, but it isn't really. It's vaguely interesting, but it's not much use, and it's not much threat either. Let's look back at what Luke says. Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. With this in mind, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things you've been taught. In other words, Luke says he wasn't there. He didn't know what happened at the time, and there were lots of accounts of what happened doing the rounds. So he investigated it carefully. He listened to the people who were actually there and wrote up his version. In other words, he used sources. And the Gospels use lots of historical markers to tell us that the events are ones that happened in real history. Here's Luke 3, 1-2, for example. In the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, when Pontius Pilate was governor of Judea, Herod, tetrarch of Galilee, his brother Philip, tetrarch of Iturea and Trachonitis, and Lysanias, tetrarch of Abilene, during the high priesthood of Annas and Caiaphas, the word of the Lord came to John, son of Zechariah, in the wilderness. And they use things like genealogies, which show it's about real people who have real ancestries. But where some of the fear about this comes from is there's a movement you may have come across called the Quest for the Historical Jesus, and particularly the work of a group called the Jesus Seminar, which basically says that because the Gospels seem to be based on sources, that they aren't reliable. They tell us what the church wanted people to hear about Jesus, rather than what he actually did and said. But what makes all the difference to the source criticism theories is the timescale involved and the role of eyewitnesses. Let's take a step back and look at the history for a moment. Jesus lived in a period known as Roman Second Temple Judaism. That means the Romans were in charge and the Second Temple was still standing. That's actually a fairly short period. In AD 6, the Romans create the province of Judea. In 33, Jesus dies and rises from the dead. In about 36, Paul is converted. The first New Testament book is probably written in about the year 48. Acts comes to an end, the story there, in AD 62. In AD 64, there's the Great Fire of Rome, and Nero starts killing Christians until AD 68. In 66, the Jews do a big revolt against Roman rule, which leads in AD 70 to the destruction of Jerusalem and the Temple. And in many ways, the key date here is AD 70, because Jesus predicted that the Temple would be destroyed. We know that because the Christians saw the signs that Jesus gave for the destruction of the temple and fled to the hills like he said. But the temple's discussed quite a bit in the New Testament, and nowhere does it mention the destruction of the temple as a past event, even though it would add a lot to the argument of Hebrews or of the Gospels. The Gospels record what Jesus said about it. And what that means is that the Gospels, certainly Mark, need to have been written down before it happened. And in fact, just about everyone accepts that Mark was written in the early 60s AD. Now, why is that important? Because it's only 30 years after the events happened. There are still lots of eyewitnesses around. In fact, though there's a few who die earlier, James and Stephen, most of the major witnesses are around until the late 60s AD. It's 30 years. It's like writing an account of the fall of the Iron Curtain today. Yes, some of the key people involved are dead, but lots of them are still alive. You can go and ask them, is this the way that it happened? And they can say yes or no. The problem with the Jesus Seminar type model is that it assumes the eyewitnesses must have gone up to heaven at about the same time that Jesus did, so that all that's left is stories with no one to check on them. But what we know is that many of the major eyewitnesses were around until after some of the Gospels were written. Peter, for example, was almost certainly killed by Nero between AD 64 and 67. Christian tradition says Peter dies nearer 64 and Paul nearer 67, but they're both in that gap. And there's a key phrase that comes up in Acts and in John, the idea of being witnesses from the beginning. So when the apostles are looking to appoint another apostle to replace Judas in Acts 1, they look for someone who's been a witness from the beginning, who'd been on the scene from when John baptized Jesus all the way through to the crucifixion. The apostles are seen as official eyewitnesses of everything that Jesus did. Now imagine this, you're Simon Peter. For the last 30 years, you've effectively been the chief witness of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. In the early 60s AD, you find yourself in prison in Rome. What do you do to make sure that your witness can carry on in case the emperor decides to kill you? Answer: you write it down. Except you can't write in the most commonly spoken language, Greek. Peter tells us in 1 Peter he needed his friend Silas to do that. So you find someone who can write it, and you get them to write it down. Now that's exactly what a Christian called Papias, who lived in the 100s AD, said happened with Mark's Gospel. And it's fascinating, a scholar called Richard Balcombe noticed this. If you go through Mark's Gospel, Peter is in almost every scene until he denies Jesus 3 times and runs away. And after that, in pretty much every scene where Peter isn't, Mark starts naming minor characters in the scene which he hasn't bothered with before. So Simon of Cyrene has 2 sons called Alexander and Rufus who see Jesus carrying the cross. Mary, and Salome see the crucifixion and observe where Jesus is buried. And there's lots of emphasis on the text in what they saw. And Mark's Gospel ends with them being sent to tell Peter what they've seen. It's exactly like Mark is actually Peter's eyewitness account, with a handful of other people roped in as named eyewitnesses for the bits that Peter missed. You get similar things in Luke and Acts. We know from Acts that Luke travelled around the Mediterranean with Paul, and that while Paul was in prison in Caesarea, Luke was based in Jerusalem, where he had the opportunity to talk at length to Mary and the disciples. And everything in Luke's gospel that the disciples aren't present for? Mary's there. Or it's things that happen to people who are close to her. In John's gospel, there seems to be a different set of witnesses. Thomas, Philip and John are much more major characters than they are in the others, but it still looks like eyewitness accounts. And in all four Gospels, they all seem to be thoroughly set in this fairly small world of Roman Second Temple Judaism, written by people who know that world well. So if you look at cemeteries from the time, you can see how common different names are in Roman Second Temple Judaism, and you can see that it's quite different from Roman culture elsewhere, and different from Jewish culture elsewhere in the Mediterranean at the time. So Stephen is a common name among Jews from elsewhere, but not in Israel. Simon, Joseph and Mary are really common names in Israel, but not outside. And the Gospels get it consistently right. When people have common names, they get extra names added as well, like Simon Peter or Simon the Zealot. People have exactly the right names for that specific time and that specific place. Or take geography. The Gospels name loads of places in Israel, often tiny villages, and they get the travel times between them correct. Or botany. Sycamore fig trees grow in the Jericho area, like Luke says, but they don't grow in Syria, Italy, Turkey or Greece. Or in John chapter 5 it says this: "There is in Jerusalem near the sheep gate a pool, which in Aramaic is called Bethesda, and which is surrounded by 5 covered colonnades." This used to be a cause for some controversy. After all, how could a pool be surrounded by 5 covered colonnades, and why didn't anyone know about it? And then archaeologists found it. Here's a picture of the reconstruction. You can see how there are 5 covered colonnades because the pool is in 2 halves which connect underwater. And you get the same thing in the rest of the New Testament. In Acts 17, Luke says the people in charge of the city of Thessalonica were called politarchs. It's an unusual word, and people used to say that he'd obviously got it wrong. But then they excavated Thessalonica a bit more and found that Acts got it right and the history books got it wrong. There's loads of examples like that. The existence of Pontius Pilate would be another example. If you want one from the letters, Romans 16 says the director of public works in Corinth is called Erastus, and some people thought he was made up until they found a big stone inscription in Corinth about him. And none of that proves that the New Testament is true in what it says about Jesus, but it shows us that the minor details about the world it was set in are correct. It was written by people who knew the places they're talking about at the times when the events they describe happened. In other words, there's a very good chance the authors of the New Testament knew what actually happened. They'd clearly either been there themselves or spoken to people who were there. And the question is, can we trust them? And I guess that can break down into, can we trust their memories? And can we trust their motivations? Let's think about memories. Research in cognitive psychology has shown events are more likely to be remembered accurately when the events were unique or unusual, when they were important, when the eyewitnesses were emotionally involved in the events, when the events are frequently rehearsed, so when the witnesses tell the story often. For those of my generation, an easy example would be, you can ask me, where was I when I heard about 9/11? And I know exactly where I was and what I was doing. I was a teacher, I remember which class I'd just taught. I even remembered before the lesson I'd walked past a load of people crowded round a TV, but I'd been busy and so I hadn't stopped to watch. And that's 20 years ago. Will I still remember that in 10 years' time? Of course I will. I think it's very likely when I'm 50 I'll still be able to remember significant things that happened when I'm 20. And all the more so if I've been talking about them in the meantime. I remember going to visit a very old man who was part of our church in the hospital. As a young man, he'd fought in World War II. The plane he was in had been shot down, but he'd parachuted out and survived. And he'd spent the next 70 years telling the story again and again. And when I went to visit him, he couldn't remember much about anything. He didn't know which century it was. He thought he was in hospital, having just been brought back after the war finished. Why? Because even when he'd forgotten his wife and family, and everything that had happened since, he could still remember the parachute and the prisoner of war camps. Talking about things grows your memory of the event, and these were events the apostles had been talking about for the 30 years since they happened. and bits and pieces of it are also confirmed by non-Christian historians who obviously hadn't looked into it that closely and who are telling things with their own agendas. So both Josephus and Lucian indicate Jesus was regarded as wise. Pliny, the Talmud, and Lucian imply he was a powerful and revered teacher. Josephus and the Talmud indicate he performed miraculous feats. Tacitus, Josephus, the Talmud, and Lucian all mention that he was crucified. Tacitus and Josephus say this occurred under Pontius Pilate. The Talmud declares it happened on the eve of Passover. There's references to Christian belief in Jesus' resurrection in Tacitus and Josephus. Josephus records that Jesus' followers believed he was the Christ or Messiah, and both Pliny and Lucian indicate that Christians worship Jesus as God. Now, last time I did this talk, over half the questions afterwards were about Josephus, so it's worth a quick look at who he was and what he wrote. As I mentioned last time, Josephus was a Roman historian. He was born a few years after the death and resurrection of Jesus, and he fought in the Jewish war which led to the destruction of Jerusalem. Actually, he fought on both sides. He was a Jewish commander who defected to the Romans partway through and ended up as chief translator for the army that destroyed the temple. In his old age, he realised much of what he'd seen would be forgotten with him. So he wrote a history of the Jews, with a particular focus on their conflict with the Romans and how it all ended. And in this history, Jesus gets mentioned twice. One time it's talking about the execution of Jesus' brother, where it calls him the brother of Jesus who was called Christ. That's not really controversial. The other time, the style suddenly changes and goes off into a florid passage about how Jesus is greater than any human and rose from the dead and so on. Lots of things that Josephus manifestly didn't believe. And the problem is, we're not reading the original, we're reading copies. It looks very much as if some of the early copies of Josephus were done by a Christian monk who thought it wasn't respectful enough of Jesus and altered it to fit his theology. Thankfully, textual criticism exists for just this sort of problem, and there's a couple of copies of Josephus that weren't in Latin or Greek, languages dominated by Christian scribes. Instead, they were in things like Arabic or Syriac. Here's a couple of reconstructions of what Josephus probably said about Jesus. In one case from an Arabic manuscript, which seems to quote from a non-doctored copy of Josephus. In the other case, by scholarly reconstruction using textual criticism of the Greek and Latin versions. And as we can see, both versions back up the basic shape of the New Testament story. Let's think about their motivation. It used to be that people suspected folk who told a story with a motive. You'd only accept an account of the event if the person told it dispassionately, but now we often recognise that with some events that doesn't happen. When I was at school, we had a Holocaust survivor come into one of our lessons to talk about their time in Auschwitz. Why? Because for the most significant events, personal testimony really matters. And when it comes to events like the life, death and resurrection of Jesus, they really matter. And what we believe happened there makes a huge difference to our lives. The fact is, we have 4 accounts of those events, and they all agree that it happened, and that Jesus really rose from the dead, and therefore we can have hope that goes beyond death and have our sins forgiven. But if it wasn't true, if it was a made-up story, then the people who wrote the Gospels would have known, and they wouldn't have had anything to gain from saying it if they knew it was false. In fact, what they gained from their witness to the events was often a horrible death. We've been saying the Gospels were written down at about the same time Nero was trying to kill off church leaders. What we have in the Gospels isn't neutral history, because there isn't actually any such thing. What we have is a record of the life-changing and history-making impact that Jesus had on those who were there, on those who looked into it later. And we can see from the history books their lives were transformed. Something clearly happened in Jerusalem in about AD 33 that transformed a bunch of mostly uneducated fishermen into a world-changing movement that is still going on today. If you want to know what happened, the best way is to ask the people who were transformed. And the New Testament is what they said. And it's striking that what they say often doesn't make them look good. Peter comes across as a loudmouth who always puts his foot in it and denies Jesus when things get difficult. Thomas doesn't believe that Jesus really rose from the dead, so Jesus has to appear to him again. The first witnesses to the resurrection are women in a culture where women's testimony wasn't trusted in court. All in all, I think we can say we've got ample evidence to say the New Testament is both accurate and reliable. That the people writing it were in a position to know what happened, that they tried to write accurate accounts rather than self-serving ones, and that it's corroborated by other ancient historians. Next time we're going to look at the question of whether the books we've got in the New Testament are the right books.